The morning had arrived with the kind of perfection that only early autumn in the Pacific Northwest could deliver. Marcus Davidson sat in the cab of his pickup truck outside the Riverside hardware store on Main Street in Portland, watching the mist gradually dissipate from the Willamette River in the distance. His coffee had grown lukewarm in the ceramic mug that bore the faded logo of his contracting business, Davidson and Sons, though there were no sons anymore, just Marcus, now 58 years old, working the kind of steady, unremarkable life that he had come to appreciate with the full weight of decades behind him. The truck's engine ticked softly as it cooled, and he found himself lost in the rhythm of the morning, the way the light caught the burnished maple trees that lined the downtown streets. For the past 3 years, everything in Marcus's world had maintained a careful equilibrium. His contracting business, which specialized in residential renovations and structural repairs, had developed a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and honest pricing, the kind of virtues that accumulated into steady work and reliable income. His crew of 3 permanent employees and a rotating roster of specialists had become as familiar to him as his own reflection, and they moved through their various projects with the quiet competence of people who understood their craft. The work provided structure, purpose, and enough engagement to fill the hours without demanding so much that it became consuming. Marcus had learned to find contentment in the minor victories of a well-executed renovation, in the satisfaction of seeing a client's vision transformed into concrete reality. But the real anchor of his life, the center around which everything else had orbited, had been Eleanor. His wife of 32 years had possessed a quality that Marcus had never quite been able to articulate to anyone else, though he had tried countless times in the aftermath of her death. She had been precise in the way that some people are passionate, not with the theatrical intensity of certain personalities, but with a deep, methodical dedication to understanding how things worked, why people behaved as they did, and what the proper way of accomplishing any given task might entail. Eleanor had kept meticulous records of everything from their household finances to the genealogy of her family, maintaining leather-bound journals and color-coded filing systems in an age when most people had abandoned such practices in favor of digital solutions. 18 months ago, Eleanor had experienced what the physicians at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital had characterized as a sudden cerebral aneurysm. The event had occurred on a Tuesday afternoon while she was working in her pottery studio, the converted storage shed that had become her sanctuary over the past decade. One moment she had been centering clay on the wheel. The next moment, according to the EMTs who arrived at the scene, she had collapsed. The doctors spoke of the catastrophic nature of the bleed, the overwhelming neurological insult, the impossibility of intervention given the severity and location of the rupture. They used clinical language with practiced sympathy, as though precision in terminology could somehow make the outcome less devastating. The funeral had taken place on a grey October afternoon, and the succession of well-meaning people offering condolences had blurred together into an indistinct mass of sympathy that had felt both genuine and utterly useless. Marcus had nodded, accepted embraces, thanked people for attending, and through it all had felt as though he were watching himself perform the role of the bereaved husband from some distance outside his own body. Eleanor's brother Thomas had spoken, their daughter Rebecca had read passages from Eleanor's favorite poets, and colleagues from the museum where Eleanor had volunteered had shared anecdotes about her quiet competence and her surprising humor. Everyone agreed that she had been exceptional, remarkable, one of those people whose absence would leave a genuine void in the community. In the months following her death, Marcus had found himself unable to alter anything in their house. Eleanor's reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside the bed they had shared, placed precisely where she had left them before heading to her studio that final afternoon. Her gardening boots remained by the back door, caked with the soil from the raised beds where she had grown heirloom tomatoes and unusual varieties of herbs that she sourced from specialty seed catalogs. The kitchen contained her collection of vintage recipe cards, each one annotated in her precise handwriting with notes about technique, substitutions she had made, or observations about variations in results depending on ingredient sources. And the studio itself, that intimate space where Eleanor had spent hundreds of hours developing her skills as a ceramicist, remained sealed off from the rest of Marcus's life, a kind of shrine to her presence that he had neither the courage nor the will to disturb. The truck's radio played softly, a classical station that Eleanor had preferred, and Marcus found himself once again lost in the comfortable numbness that had become his default state. He had appointments scheduled for the afternoon, client consultations that required his attention and professional demeanor. The business needed to function regardless of his internal landscape. Clients did not care about his grief, and he did not expect them to. This was simply the contract that an adult entered into with the world. You continued forward, you maintained your obligations, you allowed the momentum of ordinary life to carry you through the difficult periods until the acute pain gradually dulled into a manageable ache. But even as he sat there in the cab of his truck, Watching the downtown Portland morning proceed with its ordinary commercial rhythms, Marcus felt something subtly wrong with the texture of his contentment. He was not yet conscious enough to name his concern, but rather a kind of atmospheric pressure, the way the air might feel just before a storm system moved through, when changes in barometric pressure create an almost subliminal sense of unease. He told himself it was simply the weight of accumulated grief, the way that mourning could sometimes return unexpectedly even after he thought he had reached some kind of equilibrium. The mind and body, he had learned, did not follow the logical progressions that the self-help literature suggested. Healing was not linear. Acceptance did not arrive as a permanent state but rather as intermittent moments of grace interrupted by sudden regressions into acute pain. His phone, which lay on the passenger seat beside a folder containing estimates for a kitchen renovation project, suddenly began to vibrate against the worn leather. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, a Portland area code that he should have recognized, but the specific digits triggered no immediate sense of familiarity. The call came from a local number, yet not one that appeared in his contacts list or in the recent call history that he occasionally reviewed. For a moment, Marcus hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button. He had become, in recent years, somewhat protective of his time, reluctant to engage with unknown callers who might be selling something or soliciting donations. He very nearly allowed the call to route to his voicemail service. Had he known what that decision not to ignore the call would set in motion, whether he would have answered differently remained a question he would contemplate many times in the months to come. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a woman, though Marcus could not initially place her. She identified herself as Susan Keller and explained that she worked as a registered nurse at Portland Medical Center, specifically in their administrative and medical records department. She had called to inform Marcus of something unusual that had emerged during a routine digitization and archival process that the hospital was undertaking in preparation for a transition to a new electronic health record system. Her tone was professional yet somewhat uncertain, as though she were navigating carefully between obligations and hesitation about the wisdom of making this particular call. "Mr. Davidson, I want to preface this by saying that I understand this may seem unusual or even intrusive," Susan began, her words coming carefully as though she had rehearsed them multiple times before actually dialing. "My intention is not to cause distress but rather to bring something to your attention that I believe you have a right to know. I actually worked with your wife, Eleanor, about 2 years ago. We were both involved in a community health education program at the hospital, and we developed a professional relationship and also what I would describe as a genuine friendship based on mutual respect for one another's commitment to thorough, ethical work." Marcus felt his chest tighten slightly, not with dread precisely, but with that subtle shift in atmospheric pressure intensifying, becoming more tangible and present. He had not been prepared to hear Eleanor's name invoked by a stranger, and the unexpected nature of the reference created a momentary disorientation. Susan continued, "When we were digitizing our medical records database recently, I came across some patient files that had been misfiled or archived in a manner that suggested they had been deliberately removed from the main system. I discovered among these files a series of medical tests and toxicology screens that were performed on Eleanor approximately 18 months ago, just before her death. The tests are dated over several months, and they appear to have been ordered through our hospital system, though they were billed directly to Eleanor's private account rather than being processed through her insurance." The specificity of these details began to penetrate Marcus's initial confusion, and he realized that he was no longer simply listening to a polite explanation but rather receiving information that carried significant implications. He had assumed he understood the complete picture of Eleanor's final months, the progressive symptoms, the medical evaluations, the eventual catastrophic event that had ended her life. The notion that Eleanor had undergone additional medical testing without his knowledge introduced a troubling note into the narrative he had constructed. "What kind of tests are we discussing?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding strange and distant even to his own ears, as though someone else was speaking through his mouth. He had pulled into a parking space in front of the hardware store and sat motionless, staring at nothing in particular through the windshield. "The tests indicate elevated levels of digitalis glycoside in her bloodstream," Susan replied, and Marcus could perceive in her voice a carefully modulated tone that suggested she had rehearsed not merely the decision to call but also the precise way in which she would deliver information that she clearly understood would be shocking. "Digitalis glycoside is a cardiac active compound derived from the foxglove plant. In proper pharmaceutical formulations and carefully controlled dosages, it is used in the treatment of certain cardiac arrhythmias and congestive heart failure. However, in higher doses or with prolonged ingestion without medical supervision, it can be extraordinarily toxic. The compound can accumulate in the body over time, causing progressive cardiac complications that would manifest as fatigue, palpitations, arrhythmias, and eventually potentially catastrophic cardiac events. The phone felt heavy in Marcus's hand, and he became acutely aware of the slight tremor that was beginning in his fingers. Eleanor had been complaining about fatigue in the months before her death. He remembered now with sudden clarity. She had mentioned heart palpitations to her primary care physician, and the doctor had ordered various tests that had all come back within normal ranges. There had been a frustrating quality to those final months, an increasing sense that Eleanor felt unwell despite the medical establishment's inability to identify a specific pathology. The doctors had attributed her symptoms to stress, to the normal aging process, to psychosomatic manifestations of anxiety. "I need you to understand that I am not making a medical diagnosis or accusation," Susan continued, her professional demeanor strengthening as she moved into territory that was clearly well within her comfort zone. "However, I believe that you needed to know that your wife had been secretly seeking medical evaluation for what appears to be some form of poisoning exposure. The test results are documented in her medical record, and her symptoms as recorded by the physician who ordered the tests are consistent with chronic digitalis toxicity. I have taken the liberty of photographing the relevant documents, and I would be grateful if you could come to the hospital at your earliest convenience to review them in person." This last request, framed as a request but carrying the weight of something more formal, sent another wave of disorientation through Marcus. The comfortable structure of his life, the narrative of accidental tragedy and inexorable loss that had provided a kind of meaning to his grief, suddenly shifted and destabilized beneath him like ground trembling in the early stages of an earthquake. "Why are you telling me this now?" Marcus heard himself ask, though he was not entirely certain what answer he expected to receive. Why would Eleanor not have mentioned any of this to me? Why would she undergo medical testing without informing me? There was a significant pause on the other end of the line, and when Susan's voice resumed, it carried an additional weight that suggested she was about to share information that represented either a violation of professional confidentiality or an ethical imperative that had superseded her normal professional boundaries. "There are notes in her medical record," Susan said quietly, indicating that Eleanor specifically requested that her testing be kept confidential and not shared with her spouse. She wrote in the intake form that she was concerned about someone in her immediate household, and she was attempting to gather medical evidence before making a decision about how to proceed. The physician who treated her noted that Eleanor appeared fearful and that she had asked specifically about the confidentiality of test results before consenting to the evaluation. The parking lot of the hardware store, the downtown Portland morning, the ordinary commerce of the world proceeding around his stationary truck, all of it suddenly felt abstract and unreal. Eleanor, his Eleanor, had been frightened enough to seek medical evaluation in secret. Eleanor, who shared her life completely with him, who kept meticulous records of everything and discussed finances and plans and concerns with methodical precision, had apparently felt unable to discuss whatever had prompted her to seek these tests. Eleanor had suspected something so significant that she had attempted to gather evidence before revealing it. "I would like you to come to the hospital," Susan said finally. "There are other documents that you should see. Can you come today? Can you come alone? I think it would be better if this information were not shared immediately with others." Marcus agreed to meet her, and the call concluded with the kind of awkward finality that characterized conversations in which shocking revelations had been delivered but not fully processed. He sat in his truck for several minutes after the call ended, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his mind struggling to accommodate this new information into the existing structure of his understanding about Eleanor's death. The medical records that Susan spread across her small office desk at Portland Medical Center created a visual representation of something that Marcus's mind seemed to resist fully comprehending. The documents themselves were mundane in appearance, standard hospital forms, laboratory results with their characteristic formatting and technical notation, printed on ordinary white paper with the hospital's logo and various identifying information. Yet the content they contained introduced a completely different narrative about Eleanor's final months, one that transformed her death from a tragic accident into something far more sinister. The blood work results, dated over a 7-month period, showed progressive elevation in digitalis glycoside concentrations within Eleanor's system. The initial test, conducted approximately 9 months before her death, showed levels that Susan characterized as mildly elevated. Subsequent tests at monthly intervals revealed a pattern of increasing accumulation, suggesting ongoing exposure to the compound rather than a single exposure event. The final test, conducted just weeks before Eleanor's death, showed concentrations that Susan described as substantially elevated and potentially approaching levels where significant cardiac complications would become probable. The concerning aspect of this pattern, Susan explained, her professional demeanor both reassuring and deeply troubling, is that the progressive accumulation suggests sustained exposure over an extended period. This is not consistent with accidental exposure or with a single poisoning event. Someone would need to have been deliberately administering the substance to Eleanor on a regular basis, likely through her food or beverages, for many months prior to her death. Marcus listened to this explanation while staring at the numbers on the laboratory reports, trying to process the implication that his wife had been systematically poisoned over an extended period. The quantity of digitalis present in her system at the time of her final medical evaluation was far below what would cause immediate acute symptoms, but the physician's notes indicated concern about the chronic toxicity and potential cardiac complications. The pathology report from her autopsy, Susan continued, her voice taking on a more careful quality, was consistent with a severe cardiac arrhythmia leading to sudden cardiac death. However, reviewed in light of the toxicology evidence, we can now understand that her heart was already compromised by months of digitalis exposure. The stress of an arrhythmia that her healthy heart might have tolerated became fatal because her cardiac tissue had been damaged by prolonged exposure to this toxic compound. Marcus found himself unable to formulate a coherent response. The implications were cascading through his consciousness like water finding fissures in a dam. Eleanor had been poisoned, deliberately and systematically. Someone in her life had been administering poison to her over a period of months. Someone close enough to have access to her food and beverages. Someone she trusted enough to accept food from without suspicion. And Eleanor, realizing what was happening, had sought medical confirmation without revealing her suspicions to him. Why didn't she tell me? Marcus heard himself ask again, and this time his voice carried a quality of anguish that he had not permitted himself to express in the 18 months since her death. Why would she attempt to manage this alone? Why would she not come to me if she suspected someone was poisoning her? Susan consulted her notes, and when she spoke, her explanation carried the weight of someone who had clearly reflected extensively on this question. According to the physician's notes from her consultation, Eleanor expressed extreme concern about the emotional impact that revealing her suspicions would have on you. She also expressed fear that whoever was responsible might alter their behavior if confronted, which would make it impossible to gather conclusive evidence. The physician advised her to contact law enforcement immediately, but Eleanor asked for time to think about the situation and to gather additional evidence before making that decision. Eleanor had been protecting him. Marcus realized with a shock of comprehension that felt like a physical blow to his chest. She had become aware that she was being poisoned, had sought medical confirmation, and then had attempted to gather evidence while simultaneously protecting him from the knowledge of what was happening. The isolation of that experience, the burden of carrying such a terrible secret, of gradually realizing that one's body was being systematically compromised by someone in one's trust circle, it was almost incomprehensible. There is something else, Susan said carefully, pulling from her desk drawer a sealed envelope bearing Eleanor's handwriting. The envelope was addressed to Marcus, his name written in Eleanor's precise hand on the front. Eleanor brought this to her physician and requested that it be given to you in the event that something happened to her. The physician placed it in her medical file with the notation that it was to be delivered to her next of kin. It was only discovered during the digitization process. Eleanor clearly intended for you to receive this. Marcus accepted the envelope with trembling hands. It was sealed, the flap secured with tape across which Eleanor had written for Marcus, "Read only if something has happened to me." The weight of it felt disproportionate to its physical mass, as though the paper contained something far heavier than mere words. "I think you should read that in private," Susan suggested gently. "There is also one more thing that you should know." Eleanor brought in a small metal container during one of her medical consultations. She indicated that she had been collecting samples of medications or supplements that she suspected were being administered to her without her knowledge. She requested that the contents be tested for digitalis glycoside. Those samples were indeed found to contain the compound in concentrated form. Eleanor also brought in detailed written records of her exposure, notes about when and where she had felt unwell, what she had consumed, observations about unusual behavior from people in her life. Susan pulled from the file a series of handwritten pages, Eleanor's careful script filling page after page with observations, dates, and notations. The documents appeared to be entries from a personal journal, yet organized with the methodical precision that had always characterized Eleanor's approach to any serious matter. The first entries, dated nearly 14 months before Eleanor's death, were relatively observational, simple notes about unusual fatigue, heart palpitations, symptoms that the physicians had attributed to stress or anxiety. But as the months progressed, the entries became increasingly specific and increasingly alarming. Eleanor had noted specific dates on which she experienced severe symptoms, often correlating them with meals or beverages. She had observed unusual behavior from various family members and associates. She had documented patterns in her symptoms that appeared to correlate with her interaction with certain individuals. And she had begun, in the later months, to express her hypothesis in increasingly explicit terms. The final entries, dated just days before her death, contained notations that seemed almost prophetic in their clarity. Eleanor had written with cold precision about the likelihood that her heart condition would deteriorate to fatal levels within a matter of weeks. She had written about the unfairness of the situation, the rage she felt at being betrayed by someone she had trusted, and her determination that truth would emerge even if she did not survive to witness it herself. Yet nowhere in the hundreds of pages of notes did Eleanor explicitly name the person she suspected. She referenced family member A and business contact B and other deliberately vague identifiers, as though she remained uncertain of the facts even as the medical evidence accumulated. "The police should be contacted," Susan said quietly. "This is a matter for law enforcement." What Eleanor documented, combined with the medical evidence and the samples she collected, potentially constitutes proof of deliberate poisoning. The person responsible should face criminal charges. Marcus sat in that small hospital office, surrounded by evidence of Eleanor's suffering and her systematic documentation of her own slow death, and felt the entire foundation of his understanding about his life begin to collapse. His wife had been murdered, not accidentally, not by fate, but by human agency. Someone close to her, someone she had trusted, had deliberately administered poison to her body over a period of months, watching as it accumulated, watching as her health deteriorated, and proceeding anyway. And Eleanor, with the methodical precision that had always defined her character, had gathered evidence in secret, had documented everything, and had entrusted that documentation to emerge only after her death. She had protected her husband from the knowledge of her suffering, while simultaneously ensuring that the truth would eventually be revealed. It was an act of love and an act of accusation, performed simultaneously by a woman who had understood that she was dying but who had maintained enough clarity of purpose to ensure that justice might eventually be served. The meeting with Detective Amanda Liu took place 3 days after Marcus had received Eleanor's documentation from Susan Keller. The Portland Police Bureau had established a dedicated task force for cases involving financial crimes and suspicious deaths, and Detective Liu had been assigned to investigate the circumstances surrounding Eleanor Davidson's death based on the medical evidence that Susan had reported and the extensive documentation that Eleanor herself had compiled. Detective Liu was a woman in her mid-50s, with the demeanor of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement and who had developed an almost preternatural ability to recognize patterns of deception and manipulation within the complex web of human relationships. She conducted her interview with Marcus in a conference room at police headquarters, with a second detective present as a witness, and she approached the matter with the kind of methodical precision that seemed to echo Eleanor's own approach to gathering evidence. "Your wife's documentation is exceptional," Detective Liu began, sliding color-coded folders across the table to Marcus with the reverence one might accord to rare historical documents. "In my experience, most people who suspect they are being harmed either keep no records at all or maintain records that are fragmentary and emotionally charged. Your wife maintained detailed chronological documentation, cross-referenced with medical findings, with behavioral observations of suspects, with specific instances and dates. She created a record that would be admissible in court, and she did so while under extreme physical and psychological stress." The folders contained photocopies of Eleanor's original handwritten notes, meticulously organized and cross-referenced. Eleanor had created a complex matrix of observations, detailing which individuals had access to her food and beverages on specific dates, which days corresponded with her most severe symptoms, and which individuals' behavior seemed to change around the times when she felt most acutely unwell. The documentation demonstrated a growing awareness on Eleanor's part that the poison was being administered deliberately and repeatedly. "Your wife ultimately identified 2 primary suspects in her notes," Detective Liu explained, and Marcus felt his breath catch as the detective turned to specific pages. "She appears to have believed that one individual was deliberately poisoning her food or beverages. The second individual was, she believed, providing access or opportunity. But more importantly, she documented specific conversations that suggest she had become aware that the motive for the poisoning involved financial gain." Eleanor had made notes of conversations with her financial advisor, a man named Richard Hartley, in which inconsistencies had emerged regarding her investment accounts. She had noted withdrawals and transfers that she did not recall authorizing. She had documented her suspicions that fraudulent documentation had been created to justify these transfers. And she had made the connection, which she had recorded in increasingly urgent language, that Richard Hartley stood to benefit substantially from her death because she had named him as the executor of her will, a position that would grant him access to her entire estate and substantial discretionary authority over the distribution of assets. Your wife's will designates Hartley as executor, Detective Liu confirmed, consulting her notes. She also appears to have designated him as trustee of various accounts and granted him substantial powers of attorney. In the event of her death, he would have had legal authority over millions of dollars worth of assets. Your wife, reading her own financial documents, appears to have realized that she was in the process of transferring control of her wealth to someone who was simultaneously poisoning her body. The implication was staggering. Eleanor had been simultaneously being defrauded and poisoned by the same individual, someone she had trusted with her financial affairs and her physical safety. The poisoning was not merely a violent crime, but also part of an elaborate financial scheme in which Eleanor's death would provide the final opportunity for her murderer to claim the wealth that had been his ultimate objective from the beginning. There is also this, Detective Liu said, and she produced a video recording on a laptop, loading a file and turning the screen toward Marcus. We found this on your wife's private computer, saved in a password-protected folder. She clearly intended for it to be discovered, but only in the event that something happened to her. This was recorded approximately 2 months before her death. Eleanor appeared on the screen, sitting in her pottery studio. She looked visibly diminished compared to her appearance in photographs from earlier in the year, and there was a quality of exhaustion in her expression that went beyond simple physical fatigue. Yet her voice, when she began to speak, carried an unwavering clarity of purpose. If someone is watching this recording, it is because I have either found sufficient courage to go to the authorities with what I have discovered, or because I am no longer alive to make that decision, Eleanor began, and Marcus felt tears beginning to flow down his face at the sound of her voice, at the knowledge that she had recorded this message knowing it might only be heard after her death. I want to be clear about what I have discovered and the actions I have taken to preserve evidence of the crimes against me. Eleanor proceeded methodically through the discoveries she had made regarding the unauthorized transfers from her investment accounts. She documented her suspicions regarding Richard Hartley's involvement in the fraud. She described her growing awareness that she was being poisoned, her decision to seek medical evaluation, and her documentation of the toxicology findings. She explained her reasoning for not immediately reporting these crimes to the authorities. I have not informed my husband, Eleanor said, and her voice carried a quality of profound sorrow, because I believe that revealing this information would immediately alert the perpetrators and would compromise my ability to gather conclusive evidence. Richard Hartley is close to my husband. They have been friends for many years, and I am certain that Marcus would be devastated by the revelation. Additionally, if Hartley became aware that I had discovered his crimes, he would likely accelerate whatever plan he has in mind or would attempt to destroy evidence. I have chosen instead to gather documentation, to preserve evidence, and to ensure that this record will survive me in the event that I cannot survive what is being done to my body. Eleanor described the samples she had collected, the detailed chronological records she had maintained, and the specific evidence she had gathered that would allow law enforcement to investigate her suspicions. She named Richard Hartley explicitly. She documented the specific financial transfers she believed were fraudulent, and she expressed her determination that justice would be served even if it could not be served while she was alive to witness it. I am afraid, Eleanor said in the final portion of her recorded statement, not for myself, but for Marcus. I am afraid of what it will do to him to learn that someone he trusted was simultaneously defrauding him and poisoning his wife. I am afraid that the revelation of these crimes will damage his ability to trust others. But I am more afraid of allowing this crime to proceed without consequence, of allowing Richard Hartley to profit from murder, of allowing my death to be dismissed as an unfortunate medical event when it was in fact the result of deliberate criminal action. So I am leaving this record. I am preserving this evidence. And I am trusting that Marcus will find the strength to pursue whatever justice is possible, even knowing that justice cannot bring me back. When the recording ended, Marcus realized that several minutes had passed during which he had not been conscious of anything except Eleanor's voice and the terrible clarity with which she had documented her own murder. Detective Liu allowed him time to compose himself before continuing. We have already begun our investigation, Detective Liu explained quietly. We have secured your wife's original documents, the samples she collected, and the medical records. We have initiated a financial investigation into Richard Hartley's activities. We are also conducting interviews with other individuals in your wife's life who might have knowledge of the circumstances. What I want you to understand is that your wife built a case against her murderer while she was dying. She anticipated that she might not survive to testify. She created a record that will allow us to prosecute this case even without her testimony. The ensuing investigation unfolded over the subsequent months with the methodical precision that Eleanor herself had demonstrated. Richard Hartley's financial records revealed a pattern of fraud extending back nearly 4 years, involving not merely Eleanor's accounts but the accounts of several other clients whom he had systematically defrauded. Forensic analysis of the samples Eleanor had collected confirmed the presence of digitalis glycoside in concentrated form within capsules that Hartley had apparently been placing in Eleanor's dietary supplements. His computer contained communications indicating that he had researched the effects of digitalis poisoning and had monitored Eleanor's health deterioration. More damaging still was the discovery that Hartley had enlisted the aid of another family member, Eleanor's cousin David, who had served as a facilitator by providing access to Eleanor's home and by occasionally administering the poison supplements. The conspiracy had been comprehensive and deliberate, and it had been motivated entirely by the financial access that Eleanor's will had granted to Hartley. The arrests took place on a grey December morning, with police arriving at Hartley's office before his staff had begun work for the day. He was led away in handcuffs while a team of detectives executed a search warrant on his home and office. The subsequent legal proceedings, which extended over the course of more than a year, became increasingly complex as Hartley's defense attorneys attempted to challenge the admissibility of Eleanor's documentation and to argue that her death had resulted from natural causes rather than from poisoning. Yet Eleanor's evidence proved extraordinarily difficult to refute. Her documentation was contemporaneous, detailed, and corroborated by medical records. The physical evidence, the samples containing digitalis, the pharmacy records showing purchases of foxglove preparations, the computer communications discussing the poisoning, all combined to create a narrative that even the most skilled defense could not successfully challenge. And Eleanor's recorded statement, despite initial legal challenges to its admissibility, was ultimately permitted to be presented in court, allowing her voice to testify to her own murder even from beyond the grave. The trial became a media sensation in Portland, generating national attention precisely because it represented such an extraordinary instance of a poisoning victim creating comprehensive documentation of her own crime. Legal scholars and criminologists reviewed Eleanor's methodical approach to evidence gathering and marveled at the precision with which she had identified her murderers despite her declining physical condition. She became, in death, something of a symbol of human resilience and clarity of purpose in the face of ultimate betrayal. Hartley was ultimately convicted on multiple charges, including fraud, theft, and second-degree murder. David, Eleanor's cousin, accepted a plea agreement in exchange for his cooperation and testimony against Hartley, receiving a substantially reduced sentence. The civil litigation that followed resulted in restitution for the fraudulent transfers, with significant additional damages awarded to Marcus as executor of Eleanor's estate. Yet as the legal proceedings concluded and the attention of the media and the public eventually dissipated, Marcus found himself contemplating a different kind of truth that Eleanor's careful documentation had revealed. Justice, in its legal form, had been served. The perpetrators had been held accountable. The fraud had been exposed and prevented from benefiting those who had committed it. Yet Eleanor remained dead, and no legal verdict could alter that fundamental reality. 6 months after Richard Hartley's conviction and sentencing, Marcus found himself standing in Eleanor's pottery studio for the first time since her death. The space had remained sealed off, a kind of shrine to her presence that he had lacked either the courage or the emotional capacity to disturb in the immediate aftermath of her death. Now, with the legal proceedings concluded and with his understanding of Eleanor's final months thoroughly transformed by the evidence she had created, Marcus felt that he could finally enter this space without being overwhelmed by the immediacy of his grief. The studio was precisely as Eleanor had left it. Her potter's wheel stood in the center of the space, and the shelf beside it still held the work she had been creating on that final afternoon. A large earthenware bowl, approximately 60% complete, sat where she had abandoned it when the aneurysm had struck. The clay had hardened and cracked, the wheel had gathered dust, and the space maintained an almost sanctified quality, as though time had stopped on that Tuesday afternoon when Eleanor's life had ended. Marcus moved slowly through the studio, examining Eleanor's tools, her carefully organized materials, the wall where she had hung samples of her work in various stages of completion. On a small wooden shelf that Eleanor used as a desk, he found her pottery journal, a record she had maintained, separate from the documentation of her poisoning, in which she had recorded her observations about techniques, experiments with glazing methods, notes about clay bodies and firing temperatures. This journal represented the Eleanor who had pursued her craft with methodical precision, who had approached ceramics with the same careful attention to detail that characterized every aspect of her life. Beside the journal lay a handwritten note, dated the morning of the day Eleanor had died. The note was brief and seemed almost casual, lacking the weight of someone writing what would be their final words, though Marcus understood now that Eleanor had likely been aware that her time was becoming limited. The note read simply, "Today I want to try a new approach to the glaze firing. Eleanor." Marcus sat at Eleanor's potter's wheel and placed his hands on its surface, connecting with the object that had consumed so much of Eleanor's attention and her time. He had no knowledge of pottery. Eleanor had attempted several times to teach him basic techniques, and he had resisted with the kind of gentle stubbornness that characterized his usual response to unfamiliar endeavors. Now, understanding that he would never again have the opportunity to learn from Eleanor herself, Marcus found the prospect of attempting to work with clay seemed simultaneously essential and utterly impossible. He began to experiment, moving the wheel slowly at first and attempting to remember the basic techniques Eleanor had demonstrated. His hands were clumsy and uncertain, and the clay refused to respond to his direction with anything approaching the precision that Eleanor had achieved. The vessel that emerged was profoundly misshapen, asymmetrical, and rough, bearing no resemblance to the refined forms that Eleanor had created with apparent ease. Yet as Marcus continued to work, moving beyond disappointment at the technical failure and into something more profound, he became increasingly aware of Eleanor's presence in the space, not as grief precisely, but as a kind of continuity. Eleanor had taught him, he realized, something far more valuable than specific pottery techniques. She had demonstrated that the careful attention to detail, the methodical documentation of one's experience, the determination to preserve truth even in the face of overwhelming betrayal, these were the qualities that mattered. Eleanor had approached her own death with the same precision she had brought to her ceramics, refusing to allow her murder to proceed without documentation, refusing to permit her death to be mischaracterized or misunderstood. In the weeks following his first return to the studio, Marcus established a routine of working with clay several afternoons per week. He gradually improved in his technical skills, though he never approached Eleanor's level of proficiency. What he discovered, however, was that the process of working with clay served a function that transcended the quality of the finished product. The rhythmic engagement with the material, the requirement to focus attention completely on the task at hand, the acceptance that failure was an inherent part of the learning process, these elements combined to create a kind of meditation that allowed Marcus to process his grief and his understanding of Eleanor's final months. He created vessels that he filled with the ash from Eleanor's original pottery works when they eventually crumbled and deteriorated. He created a series of small sculptural pieces that seemed to represent different aspects of Eleanor's journey: the careful documentation, the isolation of her knowledge, the courage required to maintain her evidence in secret while her body was being slowly destroyed by poison. None of these pieces achieved any significant level of artistic merit, yet each one carried the weight of his engagement with Eleanor's memory and with the complex legacy she had left behind. Marcus also began working with the museum where Eleanor had volunteered, establishing a scholarship program in her name and creating educational initiatives focused on the importance of careful documentation and evidence preservation in community contexts. He worked with local law enforcement agencies to develop training programs around the investigation of poisoning cases, using Eleanor's documentation as a teaching tool to demonstrate how careful record-keeping and methodical observation could support criminal investigation. He became, in a sense, a guardian of Eleanor's legacy, ensuring that her experience was preserved not as a tragedy but as a powerful demonstration of human resilience and clarity of purpose. The legal conclusion of the case did not, Marcus discovered, bring the kind of closure that conventional wisdom suggested justice should provide. The conviction of Richard Hartley did not restore Eleanor to life. The restitution of the fraudulent funds did not eliminate the loss. The public recognition of Eleanor's extraordinary courage did not ease the daily pain of her absence. Yet Marcus came to understand that Eleanor had never expected those outcomes. She had not created her documentation hoping that legal justice would restore what had been lost. She had created her documentation because documentation was what she did, with the same methodical precision she brought to ceramics, to financial management, to all aspects of her life. What Eleanor had accomplished through her careful documentation was the preservation of truth. She had ensured that her death would not be dismissed as a natural tragedy brought on by fate or circumstance. She had ensured that her murderer would face consequences for his crimes. She had ensured that Marcus would ultimately understand the truth about what had happened to her, even though the discovery of that truth was profoundly painful. She had insisted, through the only means available to her, that truth mattered more than comfort, that justice mattered more than protective ignorance, and that love meant seeing clearly rather than remaining blind. In the pottery studio, working with clay that never quite achieved Eleanor's aesthetic precision, Marcus gradually came to accept the core lesson that Eleanor had left behind. Love was not the same as blindness. Devotion to another person did not require refusing to see clearly what they might be doing or what was being done to them. The people most capable of harming us are indeed often the ones closest to us, the ones we have decided in advance to trust completely. Yet seeing that potential for harm clearly was not a betrayal of love. It was, in fact, the truest expression of love possible. Eleanor had maintained both her love for Marcus and her clear-eyed assessment of the dangers surrounding them. She had held both love and discernment simultaneously, refusing to allow either one to diminish the other. She had trusted Marcus to ultimately understand that her failure to tell him immediately about her suspicions had not reflected a lack of trust in him, but rather a careful judgment about how truth could be most effectively preserved and eventually revealed. Marcus learned to work with clay the way he learned to accept the truth about Eleanor's death, not as a path toward perfection or closure, but as an ongoing practice of engagement with reality, of attention to detail, of commitment to the preservation of what mattered most. The misshapen vessels he created eventually accumulated on shelves in the studio, and visitors who came to see Eleanor's work would occasionally ask about Marcus's contributions, usually with polite confusion about the dramatic difference in quality. Eleanor was the true artist, Marcus would explain with a kind of gentle humor that Eleanor herself would have appreciated. What I am doing is learning what she knew, that the process of creation matters more than the perfection of the created object. That attention and care and intention are valuable regardless of whether the final product achieves technical excellence. He discovered, in the months and years that followed Eleanor's death and the revelation of her murder, that love expressed itself not through comfortable denial but through clear-eyed engagement with reality. Eleanor had loved him enough to document her own poisoning carefully and methodically. She had loved him enough to gather evidence while protecting him from knowledge that would devastate him. She had loved him enough to trust him with the truth, even knowing that truth would cause him pain. Marcus came to understand that this was the deepest expression of love available to human beings, not romantic fantasy or comfortable delusion, but the willingness to see clearly, to act on the basis of that clear seeing, and to trust that the person you love will eventually understand why you made the choices you made. Eleanor had been afraid when she discovered that she was being poisoned. She had been isolated in her knowledge, unable to share her burden with the one person she loved most. Yet she had maintained her focus on the essential task of preserving evidence and ensuring that truth would survive her. The pottery studio eventually became a place where Marcus spent significant time, and he gradually began to understand that Eleanor's presence there was not a matter of supernatural manifestation or mystical connection, but rather something more grounded and real. Eleanor's presence was embedded in every tool that hung on the walls, in every notation in her pottery journal, in every example of her technique that he could observe and attempt to replicate. She was present in his own hands as they attempted the movement she had taught him, present in his growing understanding of clay and glaze and firing, present in his commitment to detail and precision that echoed her own values. The final chapter of this story does not conclude with the transcendence of grief or the achievement of perfect understanding. Rather, it concludes with the recognition that Eleanor's most important legacy was not the evidence she gathered to convict her murderer, though that was certainly consequential. Her most important legacy was the model of human life that she demonstrated through her careful attention, her methodical documentation, her refusal to allow important truths to be lost, and her trust in the fundamental decency of those she loved. Years later, when the acute pain of Eleanor's absence had gradually transformed into a more manageable melancholy, Marcus would occasionally sit at her pottery wheel and create vessels that, while never achieving Eleanor's aesthetic refinement, carried the weight of intentional creation. And in those moments of engagement with the clay, with the tools that Eleanor had used, with the space that she had claimed as her own, Marcus felt a profound sense of connection across the boundary between life and death. He had learned, through Eleanor's example and through his own painful journey, that love is not the absence of suspicion or the refusal to see clearly. Love is the commitment to seeing truly, to acting on the basis of that clear seeing, and to trusting that even painful truth is preferable to comfortable delusion. Eleanor had loved him completely, and that complete love had expressed itself through her careful documentation of her own murder. The truth that Eleanor had preserved did not restore what was lost, but it did ensure that loss would be acknowledged, that murder would not be disguised as accident, and that the human capacity for both extraordinary evil and extraordinary courage would be clearly recognized and memorialized. In the end, that was the only justice available to Eleanor, not the restoration of her life, which was impossible, but the preservation of truth and the demand that those responsible for her death face the consequences of their actions. And Marcus, learning slowly and painfully to work with clay in the studio that Eleanor had created, understood that this commitment to truth and to accountability was the most profound expression of love that Eleanor could have given him. The pottery studio became, over time, a place where people could visit Eleanor's work and also understand something of her character through the careful documentation she had maintained, through the evidence she had preserved, and through the continuing commitment of her husband to honor her memory by living with the same clarity and precision that she had demonstrated. It was not a shrine to grief or to tragedy, but rather a celebration of human resilience and the extraordinary power of meticulous attention to truth. The ultimate moral that Eleanor's life and death demonstrated was something that transcended the specific crimes committed against her or the legal justice that was eventually achieved. Eleanor understood, perhaps more clearly than most people, that love without vigilance is incomplete, but that vigilance without love is hollow. The people most capable of harming us are indeed almost always the ones whom we have decided in advance to trust completely. Yet deciding to see clearly what those close to us are doing, maintaining careful observation and documentation of concerning behavior, is not a betrayal of love but rather its fullest expression. Eleanor had lived this understanding perfectly, maintaining both love for her husband and clear-eyed awareness of the dangers surrounding them. She had documented her own poisoning not out of suspicion that poisoned all her relationships, but out of a precise commitment to truth and to the protection of those she loved. She trusted Marcus completely, yet she was willing to see that others close to them were not trustworthy. She loved her family, yet she was willing to acknowledge that love does not guarantee the absence of harm. In the final analysis, Eleanor's story is not primarily about poisoning or fraud or the criminal justice system's response to serious crimes. Rather, it is about the possibility of living with both love and clarity, with both trust and vigilance, with both connection and independent judgment. It is about the courage required to see truly, the integrity required to document what we see, and the faith required to trust that those we love will ultimately understand that our refusal to see them through the lens of comfortable delusion is the deepest expression of our commitment to them. Eleanor lived and died demonstrating that love and clear-eyed perception of reality are not mutually exclusive but rather complementary aspects of a fully human life.